The Forgotten Movie Treatments from the 1970s. This is episode 63.
You're listening to 70s Trek with Bob Turner and Kelly Casco, the fan podcast that looks at Star Trek in the 1970s. It was the decade that built a franchise.
Hello and welcome to 70s Trek. This week we answer the question, what happened after the God Thing script was rejected? I'm Bob Turner.
And I'm Kelly Casco. There were two movie treatments written in 1976. We're going to tell you about the stories in those treatments, but first,
we need to tell the listeners how to find us. Just visit our Facebook page. It's facebook.com/70s Trek. And you can also send us an email to 70strek@gmail.com.
You can also find the show on iTunes, Stitcher, and SoundCloud. Just search for 70s Trek, and when you do, we hope you will leave us a comment, a review. It helps other people find the show.
Back in episode 45 of 70s Trek, we told you the story of the first Star Trek film project in 1975 and 76, Gene Roddenberry's The God Thing.
Now, if you've been playing along with us at home, you'll remember that Gene wrote a story about the Enterprise crew discovering God, or, more exactly, Gene's version of the nature of God.
Yeah, according to Gene, God was a broken robot spaceship that visited Earth from time to time. Trying to explain God as a broken alien spaceship was not a story that Paramount really wanted to sink millions of dollars into. So guess what? That project was rejected in July 1975.
Yeah, I'm sure Gene felt like he needed to come up with something.
You think?
So he asked his assistant, Jon Povil, to take a stab at writing a treatment.
This treatment became known as Star Trek II, not Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan from 1980s, but Star Trek II, the second iteration or version of Star Trek. Kelly, you read this treatment. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, sure. So the story really is focused around Vulcans and Spock, really. And at the time, you got to remember, Spock was a very popular character. I mean, this is what he turned in his treatment in August of 1975, and Spock was huge then.
And Spock and Sarek are the only Vulcans we know of.
Right. So let me jump into the treatment here. Vulcans show up at Starfleet's door, accusing them of inappropriate behavior in the Federation of three of its starships. And these starships, and these are totally different circumstances, had fired on some targets, whatever they are. They don't go into that in the treatment. But the point is, the Vulcans are displeased with Earth and the ships and how Earth is running Starfleet. So the Vulcan diplomat demands, and this is a big thing in the treatment because a Vulcan demanding is kind of seems emotional,
right?
How they play it,
right?
But they demand that Earth be relieved of its duties as Starfleet operations, running Starfleet operations.
Oh, so Earth wouldn't house Starfleet anymore? Wouldn't be the headquarters for Starfleet?
Right.
Oh, wow.
Exactly. So, and now they can do this, right? As a Starfleet or Federation planet member, they can request that, a planet that's in charge, be relieved of its duties. Now, Starfleet, Council, they go and they look at each individual incident and declare that they're justified and that there was no wrongdoing. It was, there was no merit for the Vulcans, demands. So the Vulcans do what they feel they must, and again, feel. They withdraw from the Federation.
What?
Yes.
Really?
They just, on a dime, they go, okay, well, we're out.
That is a big move.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. I'm interested. Now you got my attention. Keep going.
Well, so everybody's scratching their head on the council. This is just odd behavior,
right,
by the Vulcans. There's no logic being played into this at all. It just seems like it's all emotions. So Kirk, who's been present for this, he's Admiral Kirk. They sign him up to take the Enterprise to Vulcan because, he did such a great job on the 5-year mission. He has good relations with the Vulcans, largely in part due to, Spock, of course, being a crew member. So they assign him the mission to go figure out why are the Vulcans, quote unquote, semi-hostile to the Federation. So what does Kirk do? Okay, yep. He pulls together the old gang, of course, minus Spock. Spock is on Vulcan. Kirk's idea is that he's going to go and talk to Spock and figure out, get the insider track, right? What's going on with this? What's going on with the Vulcans?
Right.
So they take the Enterprise to Vulcan with the old crew. This was a nice piece in this. Kirk says he was successful on this 5-year mission because of his crew. So he needed to recruit them back into the fold and into their jobs to, increase the success of the mission.
That's a nice way of bringing the gang back together. A good justification for it. Oh, yep. Good.
So they get to Vulcan, and there is a force field around the planet. Now, that doesn't scream, kind of, there's a problem here.
Yeah, right.
So the Vulcans contact the Enterprise or vice versa, regardless. And they're like, you need to leave our solar system. You're a Federation. You need to leave our solar system.
So they're being prickly.
Yes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And Kirk tries to do his, mojo on them and nothing. So
Kirk mojo doesn't work on Vulcans.
It's not working on the Vulcans. So Kirk decides, okay, let's pull back just outside of their solar system to not add any fuel to the fire and come up with a plan. So they come up with this plan of, first off, Kirk's going to get down to the planet somehow. And he has Bones do some plastic surgery, make him look like a Vulcan. That way he'll blend in. Obviously, they have a problem with people from Earth. The second, he has Scotty rig up some device to a shuttle that will basically disrupt the shield around the planet enough for them to be able to beam somebody through it.
Okay.
And so the shuttle has to go out to the field. There's like a ring around the shuttle, and it disrupts the force field long enough so that
they can shoot a transporter beam in.
Right,
oh,
right.
Cool.
They don't want to land the shuttle, obviously, because then they'll set off alarms and everything. And what they're going to do is they're going to, warp into the solar system to the planet at warp 6. Deploy the shuttle quickly, beam Kirk in, warp back out of the solar system, and then they'll do this again every so often for communication to basically to let Kirk check in.
Right.
So they execute the plan, beam Kirk in. Now the target is not just anywhere. Kirk has a friend. They don't mention who it is because he can't locate Spock.
The friend is not Spock?
It is not Spock. It's another Vulcan friend.
He's been cheating on Spock with another Vulcan?
Yes, but that's another story for another time.
I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah. So, but they have the guy's location. Okay, so that they needed a point to beam Kirk into. They beam him into his house, And this Vulcan is very noticeably upset because of their friendship. He's like, look, I can't be associated with you. I don't want to be associated. If you don't leave now, I'm turning you in. But get out of my house. Because we were friends at one time, I'm not turning you in. But you got to leave now.
Yet. I'm not turning you in yet.
Right. Well,
right.
Yeah. So Kirk leaves, and he's mingling with the population, just walking around whatever the town or city or whatever. And he's hearing a lot of grumbling from the Vulcan citizens about Starfleet, about humans, and how they're just, they're not right, just some issue with them, and just constantly talking, politics, and, this isn't right by the Federation, that isn't right. And in all this grumbling, they're even talking about how, hey, let's get back together with the Romulans. We understand them. They're really us.
Really?
Yeah. So during all this other conversation, he also hears talk about Spock and his mother being detained, and because they're human, his mother, and he's half human, and so they don't trust him. While he's working the crowd, he finds out where they're being detained, where Spock in particular is being detained, and he goes to Spock. He gets in the cell somehow, and Spock is agitated, and they're getting into it a little bit, verbally. Well, Spock is, and Spock during all of it. Okay, all he's trying to do is get Spock, and he happens at time going into the detention center where Spock is for the next communication period with Scotty, and when the Enterprise will be there, he pulls out the communicator, and Spock kind of figures what he's doing, knocks it out of his hand. But that neither here.
They scuffle a little bit,
just a little, yeah.
Oh, wow.
But that was enough for Scotty, being Scotty the superhero engineer. He goes, okay, he's trying to communicate. I'm beaming them both out, and he beams them out onto the Enterprise, and they go back out of the system. Now on the Enterprise, Spock is detained behind a force field, and Kirk and Spock are talking and really arguing. Kirk's trying to do his verbal ninjutsu on Spock, and he succeeds. And what he does is he reminds Spock that he's half human, and whatever's impacting the Vulcans, he needs to embrace his human side so that he can be reasoned with. So Spock sits down, he gives him something to think about. But he's sitting down, and he starts crying. And
Spock starts crying.
Yes.
Oh gosh.
Just breaks out in crying uncontrollably. And then he slows up and starts meditating. And Kirk he leaves, let Spock have some time to get adjusted and whatever.
So clearly, though, I mean, there's something is upsetting the Vulcans and making them emotional, or making their defenses break down. Right.
So while Spock's meditating, Kirk has a meeting with his staff. Okay, we got Spock. Obviously, Vulcans are emotional. What are we going to do? We got to do something. And the crew talks back and forth, and they talk about, well, when did Vulcans first start suppressing their emotions? Maybe we need to go back to a time before that to try and get an understanding of what's going on with Vulcans now, because they seem very emotional and not suppressing their emotion, obviously. This is the best they have, that they're going to go back in time. He tells Scotty to go start the calculations. And sure enough, here comes Spock into his quarters. And he's very happy. He's very jovial, laughing, talking. Kirk's like, how did you get out of confinement? And Spock's laugh and says, I know this ship. I know everything about it. You don't think I can't get through, my ship's force field and detention measures? And then getting past the guards, that's easy. But it's weird, obviously, because
you're saying his human side is come to the surface, and he's not only human, he's very human?
Very human.
Oh, wow.
He's more human than Spock hanging in a tree.
Whoa, 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 whoa. Wow, that's pretty darn human.
That's human.
Yeah.
So Spock has thought through this, and he thinks that this has to do with some kind of a psychic cloud that Vulcans released back in this war that happened centuries ago or hundreds of centuries ago, before Vulcans, purged their emotions. There was this big war, and to help win the war, they developed this psychic cloud. And Spock thinks that's the best chance of figuring out what's going on. So this war was, I don't know who it was with. They don't mention it, but it wasn't Vulcans. So what do? They go back in time to this place just before the cloud is released. They have Scotty beam them right to the lab where this Vulcan's at. Well, of course, this Vulcan is kind of eccentric. Like I said, he doesn't know what's happening as they're materializing. So he hits the release button, and he releases the cloud. So this cloud impacts not the enemy of Vulcans, but Vulcans. And they start acting erratic and start kind of fighting amongst themselves instead of fighting the enemy. Spock and Kirk go back to the ship, and the Enterprise destroys the enemy. The Vulcans are all, they couldn't do it. They were going to lose. Spock figures out the machine. They beam that back with them, obviously, from the planet that made the cloud, and he reprograms the cloud. So
really?
He creates a new cloud to make Vulcans passive, peaceful, more trusting.
Less aggressive, more like we know Vulcans to be?
Yes, exactly.
And he does okay, so I have a question. So he does this while he's still sort of human Spock?
Yes.
So wait a minute. So it's like the human side of Spock that reprograms this cloud that settles the Vulcans down.
Right.
And makes them more into the Vulcans we know. Really?
Today. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yep. So, obviously back to the present, it's like nothing ever happened. Like Vulcans never had a problem.
So everything is like reset.
Exactly. And that essentially is the Povil treatment.
Okay, so what happens to this treatment?
Well, so Gene got it and he read it and summarily rejected it in December of 1975. And what he did, he told Povil, and he did this very matter-of-factly, he says, it would make a nice episode, but it's not a feature.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Ooh, that's kind of cold.
Yeah, very cold.
Wow. Okay. Well, let me jump in here to pick up the story. So after Gene rejects Povil's treatment, he had the guts to turn to him, though, and say, hey, I've got an idea. Would you help me write a second treatment? And so Povil, after the redness leaves his face.
I'm sure.
Yeah, really. Says yes. And so they begin working on a second treatment in January 1976. And this treatment continues with the name Star Trek II. Again, not Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. So let me start with that story. It begins with a shot of the Enterprise dead in space, and her crew, strangely, is floating beneath her. And this weird energy field shows up. And then the crew suddenly finds themselves alive but confused back on board the ship.
So they were out of the ship?
They were out of the ship, floating around the Enterprise, which was dead in space.
Wow.
Now, they don't remember what happened to them, and Spock and Scotty and a group of scientists are missing. So Kirk, of course, says, we got to play back the logs and see what happened. And when they do that, they learn that Spock, Scotty, and these scientists had taken a shuttle to go study a black hole. And while studying the black hole, some kind of energy discharge hit the shuttle, hit the Enterprise, and then nothing else is recorded. Well, then they realize, Uhura says, I can't raise Starfleet. And Chekhov chimes in and he says, well, guess what? We're not in the Milky Way galaxy. In fact, we're so far away, it'll take us 100 years to get back home. And that weird energy mass that had floated up to the ship when they were all dead outside the ship is still there. And Kirk's trying to understand, is this strange energy thing somehow connected to what's going on? So they try to communicate with it, but it doesn't respond. So then he says, okay, and I don't know why Kirk got this idea, but he says, I'm going to try and beam myself into it. That is not an idea I would have had. And he tries, but he finds himself, after dematerializing in the transporter room, he materializes in his command chair. From all of this, he begins to sense or guess that this energy mass is somehow alive. It's some kind of alien being. And he thinks that it made a decision that it doesn't want Kirk to know a lot about it. Yeah, kind of weird, huh? But it's got these fantastic powers. Well, then suddenly the energy disappears, and then the Enterprise is moving at warp 9, and nobody understands how this happened. And in fact, the ship is suddenly different. It's been improved. It's been made better. It's been refitted. And it's been refitted in a way that Kirk surmises it's like we were meant to go on some long voyage. These improvements allow the ship to travel back to the Milky Way very quickly. And Chekhov determines that they've actually, once they come into the galaxy and he can see the stars aligned and so forth, he determines that they've actually been gone for 11 years.
Wow.
They were dead for 11 years. So Kirk orders them to go to the nearest starbase, which is Starbase 11. And so they're on the final approach, but there's no sign of Starbase 11, where it should be. Okay, this is kind of confusing. So Kirk decides to order the Enterprise to go to Earth. And on the way, they encounter a Rigilian ship, a ship from Rigel. And its captain does not recognize the fact that this is a Federation starship or a Starfleet starship. And in fact, he tells Kirk, look, Earth has never been part of the Federation. I don't know who you are, and we're going to attack. And they do. Kirk disables their ship, but it's just one more thing to be confused about. What's going on? And Kirk is growing concerned about Spock and Scotty and the scientists being missing too. And he wonders if Spock is maybe on Vulcan. And the scene shifts then to planet Vulcan, where we see Spock meditating. And he softly says, Jim? As if somehow Kirk's mind has touched his. And Spock becomes troubled by thoughts of his former life. And it's something that he hasn't thought about in years. So Kirk then decides to go to Vulcan. And he believes this psychic link between the two of them is active and that they're going to find Spock there. And when they do go into orbit, they locate Spock. Kirk beams down. And Spock is surprised to see Kirk. He really can't believe it. And he's visibly emotional. So the two of them beam, two of them beam back aboard the Enterprise, and Kirk orders the Enterprise to go to Earth. In the meantime, Kirk and Spock sit down and they try to piece together what's going on, what's happened. Somehow the universe has been altered. No one recognizes the Enterprise. Nobody recognizes Spock on Vulcan. He's been living this very isolated life. And Earth and Vulcan have had no contact. There was no first contact. They did not become allies. And so the Federation hasn't formed. Spock theorizes that a few months before the black hole mission, he had been working on the transporter trying to make some improvements. And he somehow made a time gap, accidentally created a time gap by his work on the transporter. This is all very vague. I don't have the science behind it. But Spock wonders, could this be what has caused this new reality? Does this have something to do with it? He's not sure. Spock also believes that their new mission now has something to do with time travel because of the improvements made to the Enterprise. But of course, well, who has given them this mission? And where are they supposed to go? They don't know. The Enterprise arrives at Earth, and there is no trace of Starfleet. Their version of the 23rd century is gone, and it's been replaced with a version that lacks beauty and individuality. The beautiful cityscapes that were once there in Kirk's 23rd century have been replaced by very utilitarian cities. And the people all seem to be automatons, and they're all dressed in the same uniforms, and they're just sort of shuffling back and forth. Kirk and Spock decide, well, let's beam down to a library and see what happened. And they do, but they're attacked once they're there, and they barely escape. And in the meantime, Uhura has been trying to raise Starfleet and been transmitting on Starfleet channels this whole time. And finally, she gets a very faint reply, and it is the lost shuttle with the scientists.
Ah.
It's somewhere on Earth in an isolated area, and Kirk and Spock decide, let's go there and see what happened. When they beam down, the scientists tell them that shortly after arriving on Earth, the entire landscape of the planet changed. The majority of it became this vast, ugly urban sprawl. And the people became mindless, as I said, mindless automatons, and all they do is eat, go to work, come home, go to sleep, get up, and do it all the next day. They really don't have individual lives. Kirk asks about Scotty. Where is he? And he's told that the engineer had gone to a lab to work on this time gap problem. He had the same theory that Spock had, and that Scotty was hoping to be able to go back in time and warn Kirk prior to the black hole mission to, hey, don't do it, so none of this happens.
So go back in time with the transporter.
Scotty was somehow going to go back in time and warn Kirk with whatever technology he was using.
Oh, okay.
We really don't know.
Okay.
The scientists, though, haven't seen Scotty since he left, and that was years ago. So they all beam back aboard the Enterprise. Spock begins to study the information from the library that they did get, and he discovers that they have to travel back in time to 1964. It seems like that's a point in history where something important happened. And they believe that they can go back and stop Mr. Scott from altering history because they think that's what happened. Somehow, Scotty has changed things. So they make the trip, but the ship's power has been severely drained in the attempt. They beam down in appropriate dress, so they're wearing like dress from 1964, but it's not exactly. It's a little bit different because this 1964 is different from the one we all know. They beam down and they discover this monument, and it commemorates the first appearance of someone called the Mediator. So they ask a passerby, who is this mediator person? And they're told that the Mediator brought peace and well-being to the world, and he can be found at the League of Nations headquarters in Geneva. Now, of course, if you know about the League of Nations, that was the sort of the precursor to the United Nations. It existed after World War I and between World War I and World War II. But if the League of Nations still exists in 1964, it means that World War II never happened.
Right.
So they decide they better go to Geneva. And they're wondering, is the mediator Scotty? So when they arrive there, they discover that the mediator is not Scotty. It's actually a computer. Oh. And it was a gift, at least the story goes, from aliens who left instructions on how to build it. And that building was supervised by a committee of world leaders. And then they discover that Scotty is on the premises, and they try to go to meet him. As they approach this large office and they have to kind of get their way through security, prior to getting through the doors, a man steps out and stops Kirk. That man is Winston Churchill. And he says, you can't go in there. You can't see him. You need to leave. I don't know who you are. You got to go. Kirk kind of acquiesces, and they go back to the ship. But when they're on the ship, they come up with this plan. They decide to beam the committee aboard and try to convince the committee. If they can't get to Scotty, they'll get to the committee. And so they do this. And when the group materializes in the transporter room, they're shocked to see Mao Zedong, Albert Einstein, John F. Kennedy, and Eleanor Roosevelt, members of the committee.
Wow.
And of course, the committee is dumbfounded to suddenly find themselves on a futuristic starship like the Enterprise. So Kirk explains that the ship is actually Mr. Scott's home. This is where he's from, and that he needs to return. Kirk is granted the chance to make his case to the full committee. And when he does so, he's surprised to see that one of the committee members that didn't beam aboard the ship is Adolf Hitler.
Oh, my.
Hitler is suspicious of Kirk's motives. He accuses Kirk of wanting something more than just to renew an old friendship with Mr. Scott. And besides, now, in this 1964, Scotty is an old man, and he's needed here on Earth. So we don't trust you. What do you really want? Hitler's very suspicious. Kirk decides to show this committee tapes of the true history of Earth from 1937 to 1964, the history that Scotty somehow changed. And when they begin to watch it, the committee is horrified. They see the Depression. They see World War II. They see the dropping of the atomic bomb, the Korean War, the assassination of John F. Kennedy. They can't believe that this is a history that Kirk wants them to embrace. So Kirk says to them, granted, this is an awful prospect, but progress must be made one step at a time by a great number of individuals. Mankind will finally correct these horrors on its own without the intervention of a mediator. And because of Scotty's interference, they have made themselves slaves to the mediator computer. The world is enslaved, and the only way to prevent it, Kirk argues, is to let him go see Mr. Scott. But the committee refuses, saying they don't want that horrific reality. They're great. They love what they have right now. Leave us alone. So after the committee session is ended, Kennedy quietly comes up to Kirk, and he says, you know what? I agree with you. The original timeline needs to be restored, even though millions will die in those wars you showed us. So he gives Kirk the location of where Scotty is, and it's on an island in the Pacific. And of course, Kirk and Spock go there. They arrive, they finally get to see Scotty, and he is an old man. But he's not exactly the same Mr. Scott that we knew in personality. He has become accustomed to power. He's used to getting what he wants. Scotty explained that when they first arrived on Earth, he tried to do some experiments to travel in time, and he had some success. And it took him about 5 years before he was actually able to make the true attempt. And he did, but something went wrong, and he ended up in Germany in 1937, and he was surrounded by German soldiers prior to World War II.
Yeah, probably the wrong country to be in at the wrong time.
Right. And in fact, he was imprisoned, and he found that the only way he could survive was to trade scientific information for food and clothing and whatever else. And so he did. But after doing so, he also noticed that reality was changing around him. And then suddenly the world stage had these incredibly destructive weapons that shouldn't have been seen for decades in the future. And Scotty feels responsible for this because he gave them the info.
Yeah, right.
So now he wants to mitigate the damage. You know, he sort of admitted to himself the changes had already occurred. The genie was out of the bottle, so to speak. So he set out to make sure that future changes would result in a better situation. And so that's what he began to do. He began to reshape things so that they would be better. Kirk explains how time has been altered in the future, meaning their shared 23rd century. And Scotty says that, oh, well, you know, I could even alter that time period for you if you want. He shows no signs of regret for what he's done.
Oh, my.
As they talk, Spock notices a dilithium crystal near Scott. Apparently, Scotty has somehow been able to find a dilithium crystal and refine it. And Spock says, you know what? Our power is severely tapped. We need that thing to travel back in time to 1937 and set things right. Will you give that to us? And Scotty does, saying, okay, go ahead and make your attempt. I'm an old man. I've had a good life. And who knows, he muses. Even if you're successful, maybe my reality will still exist on some other dimensional plane. This is where Scotty's head is.
Wow. Like not Scotty at all.
Not Scotty at all. They install the crystal and they try to travel back to 1937, but they only have enough power to reach 1940. And they pop into 1940 and they're like, what are we going to do? So Kirk decides, you know what? Put us in orbit over Geneva. We're going to destroy that complex. And they do. They use phasers and photon torpedoes, and they completely deplete their energy. And as the complex in Geneva explodes, so does the Enterprise. Everybody's gone.
Wow.
And then the scene shifts to Starfleet Command in the 23rd century. And there we see Kirk, Spock, and Scotty. But they're all a little bit younger. The alien entity that brought them back to life at the beginning of the film, that reshaped the Enterprise, now has saved them from destruction again and given them a gift of another chance at life. And that's how this treatment ends. So, I'm sure you're wondering.
Yes.
You've got to be wondering, what did Paramount think of this? They rejected it in the end of January. So I thought it might be good for us to take a minute to talk about our takes on these two treatments. But, you know, before I do that, I think we should also let listeners know where we got our information from. The source for these two treatments is from the book Star Trek: The Lost Years by Edward Gross. And thank you, Mr. Gross. This was some great information. So, Kelly, do you have a couple of points that you'd like to share about what you thought about the Povil treatment?
Well, first, I mean, and we talked about this on the side. Interesting that Gene rejected that, you know, Povil's treatment. I wonder what Paramount would have thought. You know, they rejected Gene and Povil's, but I wonder what they would have thought of this, the first iteration of Star Trek II.
Yeah, Gene sort of acted like a gatekeeper, sort of stopping this treatment from getting any more consideration. I agree with you. I think the story was really interesting. I liked how they turned a Vulcan on its head. Yes.
Well, I like the look at Vulcan pre-Surak, you know, pre-logic. It would have been really interesting to see that on film.
Yeah, I agree with that. Totally.
I mean, even the treatment as I read it, and obviously you could tell it was kind of long until we got to the planet or back in time, and then it sped up pretty quick. It would have been nice to get, you know, some insight of that pre-Surak history.
Yes. Again, something in 1976 we have no idea about.
Right.
No idea. What else? Anything else?
The Enterprise crew going back in time and changing history, or really making history.
Right. Fixing it.
Right. Exactly.
Yep.
So that's good and that's bad. You get to see some of, like I was talking about, some of the things we didn't know that were just hinted at during the original series, but also they're going back in time and changing time and breaking some cardinal rules here.
Yeah, it's important to realize too that these are treatments. They're not fleshed out stories. And I just thought it was fair to say that too. Treatments tend to be sort of first draft ideas that if the studio likes, then that idea will get fleshed out a whole lot more, and changes pop into those then,
Oh, yeah.
They get
sometimes
massaged.
Extensive changes.
Yeah, right.
What about your thoughts on this or your treatment?
I enjoyed reading this Roddenberry Povil treatment. I thought it was really an interesting story. Again, like you said, it is a time travel movie. It's actually quite a time travel movie. It almost reminded me a little bit of Back to the Future 2, where we go back in time and then we go back in time. What I found a little bit weak was that the entire plot relied on this energy alien that we know nothing about, that brings the crew back to life in the beginning and transforms the ship in the beginning, and then saves the crew after the Enterprise explodes at the end and rejuvenates them.
Right.
If this alien was so powerful, why did it need the Enterprise to go through the movie to fix time? Why didn't it just fix time itself?
Exactly.
And then, is this energy alien Q?
Right. That's what I was thinking the whole time you were discussing this.
Because, I know that's not what Roddenberry or Povil are thinking as they write the treatment. But sitting here in 2017, after I've watched The Next Generation, this sounds really similar to the last episode of The Next Gen. All good
years
things
to fine tune it.
Yeah, right. So who knows? That's
Yeah.
The other point I wanted to make was the idea of this alien changing the Enterprise was actually an interesting way to work in, hey, let's have a new refitted Enterprise in this movie.
Exactly.
How do we get there? Let's have some alien change it. That's interesting. I get where you're going and why you included it. Okay. And I also thought that, it was fitting that John Kennedy was the one that came to Kirk to give him the answer he needed. Where is Mr. Scott? Can you imagine that moment on screen? John Kennedy talking to Jim Kirk.
I would have liked to have seen that.
Yes. Tell me that wouldn't have been like, wow, you're kidding. And then the other moment that I really would have liked to have seen was Kirk sparring with Hitler. Verbally sparring with Adolf Hitler.
Yes. An older Hitler.
Yeah. Really interesting. And then my last point is this. I don't think Scotty would ever give scientific information just so he could survive. I think he'd probably choose death before changing history. So that character was not used properly in the treatment I read. And, I don't think it's true to Scotty's nature. Even just from what we know from the original 79 episodes, Mr. Scott's not going to do that. And it would be out of character for him to do that. And in fact, for him to do that, it is a violation of the Prime Directive.
Right.
And so, I kind of liked it. It would have been better if it was Harry Mudd that they had to go back in time.
Yes.
And Mudd had done this, or someone like that.
Right.
Or a rogue captain, rather than someone from our beloved crew who we know are almost perfect, and that's why we love them.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, then, guess what comes next? When we next get together, we'll look at a movie that directly influenced one of our favorite episodes.
It's The Enemy Below. See you then.
Thanks for listening to 70s Trek, an independent fan production. Join us next week as we explore more about the production, the actors, the producers, and the influencers of Star Trek in the lost decade of the 1970s on 70s Trek.